The termination letter slid across Harlan's polished mahogany desk like a death sentence, the corporate letterhead gleaming under the fluorescent office lights. My hands trembled as I picked up the crisp white paper, my eyes scanning the cold, calculated corporate jargon that basically said I was fired. Restructuring. Budget constraints. Difficult decision for the organization. All carefully crafted lies designed to protect the company from liability. I looked up at Harlan's face, searching desperately for any hint of remorse or humanity, but found only cold satisfaction gleaming in his dark eyes. This wasn't about company policy, performance metrics, or budget cuts. This was deeply personal, and we both knew it. For months, I'd felt his subtle sabotage creeping through every aspect of my work life. The way he'd systematically undermine my projects, dismiss my ideas in meetings, and gradually isolate me from the team. Now he'd delivered the final, devastating blow to destroy my career. My stomach churned with a mixture of shock and raw fury, but I absolutely refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down in his office. Instead, I forced myself to smile, tight, controlled, and utterly calm on the surface, and nodded professionally. "I understand completely," I said with measured composure. But inside, my strategic mind was already racing with possibilities. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of his downfall. My name is Caitlin Martinez, and I had spent 2 precious years of my life believing wholeheartedly in this company, trusting the corporate system, working harder and longer hours than anyone else on my entire team. I genuinely thought that merit mattered above all else, that honesty and dedication would eventually be recognized and rewarded. Looking back now, I realize how incredibly naive I had been about the true nature of corporate politics. As I walked slowly out of Harlan's corner office, leather briefcase clutched tightly in my trembling hand, the brutal reality hit me like a physical slap across the face. He had been playing an entirely different game all along, a ruthless game of elimination where he systematically destroyed anyone who might threaten his carefully constructed position of power. I had been the perfect target for his machinations. Hard-working, trusting, completely dedicated to the company's success, and utterly unaware of his behind-the-scenes manipulations. But there was something critically important that Harlan didn't know about my true character. I was naturally strategic in my thinking. I was patient when the situation demanded it. And I was about to show him exactly what happened when someone made the fatal mistake of underestimating Caitlin Martinez. This game wasn't over by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it was just beginning, and this time I would be playing by my own carefully crafted rules. Sitting alone in my car in the vast corporate parking lot, engine running but going nowhere, I methodically replayed every single interaction I'd had with Harlan over the past 6 turbulent months. Suddenly, all the pieces started falling into place like a complex puzzle I'd been too trusting and blind to solve before this moment. The seemingly random project delays that somehow always involved my specific assignments and no one else's. The important meetings where my carefully prepared presentations were mysteriously forgotten or removed from the agenda at the last minute. The way my innovative ideas would disappear into thin air, only to resurface weeks later as someone else's brilliant insights, complete with credit and recognition. It hadn't been simple incompetence, bad luck, or corporate bureaucracy gone wrong. It had been systematic, methodical sabotage designed to destroy my reputation and credibility. Harlan had been setting me up for complete failure from the very beginning of this elaborate scheme, carefully creating a false paper trail of missed deadlines and incomplete projects that would perfectly justify my eventual termination to upper management. But in his arrogant confidence, he'd made one critical, potentially fatal mistake in his calculations. He had foolishly assumed that I would go quietly into the night, defeated and broken by his systematic abuse. He had absolutely no idea that I'd been documenting everything out of pure professional instinct, keeping detailed records that would soon become his undoing. His overwhelming arrogance and sense of superiority would ultimately become the foundation of his complete downfall. I drove straight home to my apartment and immediately opened my laptop computer, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I created a comprehensive, detailed timeline of every single suspicious incident I could remember. I organized email chains where my urgent messages went completely unanswered while others received immediate responses within minutes. Meeting minutes that somehow never accurately reflected my actual contributions or suggestions during discussions. Project files that had been mysteriously corrupted or deleted just before critical presentation deadlines. Backup drives that failed at impossibly convenient times for Harlan's narrative. The undeniable pattern was absolutely clear once I laid everything out in chronological order with dates, times, and witnesses. But I knew that having evidence alone wouldn't be nearly enough to bring down someone in Harlan's position of power. I desperately needed allies, credible witnesses who had personally seen his discriminatory behavior and manipulation tactics firsthand. I started making a careful list of colleagues who might be willing to speak up and tell the truth. Brave people who had witnessed the subtle discrimination and psychological manipulation. Some had even quietly mentioned feeling deeply uncomfortable about how I was being systematically treated by management. Now I needed to carefully discover if any of them possessed the moral courage to support the truth when it really mattered. My comprehensive investigation was officially beginning, and I was determined to be absolutely methodical about every single step of this process. The following morning I called Dustin Walsh, a talented former colleague who had mysteriously left the company just 6 months ago under circumstances that no one had ever properly explained to the team. We agreed to meet at Romano's Cafe, a small, intimate coffee shop downtown, far away from any corporate eyes or potential eavesdropping. Over steaming cups of coffee and fresh pastries, Dustin's shocking story slowly unfolded like a perfect mirror reflection of my own traumatic experience. "Harlan did exactly the same thing to me," he said quietly, nervously stirring his coffee with obvious anxiety still lingering from his ordeal. The constant undermining of my authority, the impossible deadlines that set me up for failure, the calculated way he'd make you look completely incompetent in front of senior management during important meetings. Dustin had eventually chosen to quit rather than face the public humiliation of being terminated, but he deeply regretted not fighting back against the injustice. "I should have officially reported him to HR and upper management," he admitted with visible shame. "But I was terrified about my future career prospects, my professional references, and my family's financial security." As I listened intently to his painful account, my inner resolve strengthened like steel. This wasn't just about seeking justice for myself anymore. Harlan had clearly established a documented pattern of systematically destroying innocent careers, and someone with courage needed to finally stop him. I thanked Dustin sincerely for his brave honesty and left the cafe feeling more determined and confident than ever before. Returning to the corporate office building to collect my personal belongings and clear out my desk, I began strategically planting subtle seeds of doubt about Harlan's questionable leadership style among my former colleagues. I was extremely careful not to make direct accusations against him. That approach would have been too obvious and potentially backfired against my interests. Instead, I asked perfectly innocent questions that naturally made people start thinking critically about patterns they might have previously overlooked or ignored. "Have you noticed how many talented, dedicated people have left our department lately?" I casually mentioned to Patricia Chen from the accounting department. "I can't help but wonder if there's something specific about the management style here that's causing such unusual turnover rates." To Marco Rodriguez in the IT support department, I thoughtfully observed, "It's really strange how often our best, most promising projects seem to mysteriously fail at the very last minute around here, don't you think?" These carefully crafted comments weren't direct accusations by any means, just perfectly reasonable observations that encouraged people to think more critically about troubling patterns they might have noticed themselves but never connected before. I watched with satisfaction as colleagues began exchanging meaningful glances across the office, as hushed conversations grew quieter when certain names were mentioned in discussions. The general atmosphere throughout the entire office began to shift in subtle but noticeable ways. People were finally starting to pay serious attention to things they had previously chosen to ignore. The all-hands team meeting unfolded exactly as I had predicted it would, following Harlan's predictable pattern of manipulation and public humiliation. He called everyone together in the main conference room to announce my voluntary departure, spinning the narrative as a mutual decision about pursuing new career growth opportunities elsewhere. His performance was masterful, expressing fake sadness about losing such a valued team member, while simultaneously undermining my contributions. Then, with theatrical flourish, he lavished excessive praise on Tess Morrison, his newest favorite employee, announcing her immediate promotion to lead the innovative project I had personally developed and nurtured for 8 intense months. The bitter irony was almost too much to bear. Tess, who had barely contributed anything meaningful to the project's foundational development, was now being publicly credited with its original conception and strategic vision. I sat quietly in the back corner of the room, watching Harlan's polished performance with detached, analytical interest. He was so obviously confident, so visibly pleased with himself for orchestrating this elaborate public humiliation in front of our entire team. But I noticed other important things happening simultaneously. The uncomfortable shuffling and fidgeting from colleagues who knew the real truth, the way Patricia deliberately avoided making eye contact with anyone, the openly skeptical expression that crossed Marco's usually diplomatic face. Harlan thought he was powerfully demonstrating his absolute control and authority, but he was actually revealing his true, ugly character to everyone present in that room. Within exactly 2 weeks of my official termination date, I learned through my carefully maintained network of contacts that Tess had made a critical, potentially catastrophic error in executing the complex project I had originally built from scratch over months of careful planning. She had fundamentally misunderstood a key regulatory requirement and confidently led the entire team down a completely wrong path that would inevitably cost the company significant time, money, and client relationships. The mistake was precisely the type of oversight I would have immediately caught and corrected, having personally designed the original framework and understood every nuance of its requirements. Through my remaining friends and allies still working in the office, I strategically made sure the right people became aware of this serious problem, not through obvious gossip or direct complaints, but by asking carefully crafted questions that led them to naturally discover the critical issues themselves. Has anyone recently double-checked the specific compliance requirements on the Morrison account? I casually mentioned to Rebecca Liu, a friend in the legal department. I distinctly remember some very specific federal regulations about data handling and client privacy that seemed important. It didn't take very long at all for the dedicated compliance team to launch their own investigation and quickly discover Tess's significant oversight. The beautiful irony was that my intervention looked like genuine due diligence and professional concern, not personal sabotage or revenge. I was simply acting as a concerned former employee, looking out for the company's best interests and reputation. Sitting comfortably in my quiet apartment, I carefully organized all my accumulated evidence into one comprehensive, devastating file that told a clear story of systematic abuse and discrimination. I had screenshots of discriminatory emails, detailed documentation of biased meetings, complete records of manipulated project timelines, and witness statements from multiple colleagues who had observed the pattern of harassment. But I understood that timing would be absolutely everything in this delicate situation. If I moved too aggressively or too quickly, it would obviously look like pure retaliation from a bitter, disgruntled employee seeking revenge. I needed to wait patiently for exactly the right moment, when Harlan's own recent actions would make my carefully documented evidence appear more credible and compelling to corporate investigators. The Tess situation was turning out to be absolutely perfect for my needs. Her spectacular failure on the high-profile project would naturally raise serious questions about Harlan's professional judgment in promoting her over obviously more qualified candidates like myself. It would also clearly highlight the disturbing pattern of talented, experienced employees leaving the department under his toxic leadership style. I had learned the value of patience and strategic thinking by carefully watching Harlan's own methodical destruction of my career over many months. Now I would use that same patient, strategic approach against him, building my bulletproof case piece by piece until it became completely undeniable to corporate leadership. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and he had no idea what was coming. 3 weeks after my official termination date, I submitted a carefully crafted anonymous complaint to the Human Resources Department about workplace harassment and systematic discrimination patterns in my former department. I deliberately didn't mention my own specific situation in this initial complaint. That obvious approach would have immediately raised red flags about vindictive retaliation. Instead, I strategically focused my complaint on the broader, more concerning pattern of abusive behavior that multiple current and former employees had personally witnessed and could potentially verify. I included detailed written testimonials from former colleagues like Dustin, who had bravely agreed to provide official statements about their own traumatic experiences under Harlan's leadership. The complaint was extremely carefully worded to raise legitimate questions about leadership effectiveness and concerning employee retention issues, rather than making direct personal accusations that might be easily dismissed. I specifically requested a comprehensive investigation into overall department culture and management practices, suggesting that the company might be systematically losing valuable talent due to toxic, discriminatory leadership that created a hostile work environment. The strategic beauty of this particular approach was that it came across as genuinely concerned advocacy for current employees' welfare rather than obvious personal revenge-seeking. HR would have no choice but to take such allegations seriously because they touched on potential legal liability issues that could significantly affect the entire company's reputation and bottom line. Exactly 1 week later, my cell phone rang with an unfamiliar number. It was Harlan, and his voice was tight with barely controlled anger and obvious desperation. "I know exactly what you're trying to do here," he said without any polite preamble or professional courtesy. "This pathetic little investigation you've somehow started won't change anything substantial. You were terminated for legitimate performance issues, and absolutely everyone in the company knows it." His clumsy attempt at intimidation was laughably transparent and revealed his growing panic about the situation. I calmly let him talk while secretly recording our entire conversation on my smartphone, responding only in measured, completely professional tones that would sound reasonable to any future listeners. "I'm honestly not sure what you're specifically referring to," I replied with perfect innocence. "I've simply answered some routine questions about my general experience working there. Isn't it completely normal for HR to conduct thorough exit interviews with departing employees?" The longer he talked, the more he inadvertently revealed his deep anxiety about the ongoing investigation and his desperate fear of being exposed. He threatened to provide negative references that would destroy my career, suggested that I would never work successfully in our industry again, and generally proved beyond doubt that he was exactly the kind of abusive, retaliatory manager who shouldn't be in any leadership position. By the end of our 20-minute conversation, I had recorded solid evidence of his unprofessional behavior and obvious retaliation attempts that would strengthen my case immeasurably. The rumors and whispered conversations about Harlan's questionable leadership style began spreading naturally throughout the office like wildfire, and I didn't need to actively fuel them at all. The investigation itself was causing people to seriously re-examine their own experiences and courageously share stories they had previously kept silent about. Patricia from accounting began quietly mentioning to others that she'd always felt deeply uncomfortable about how certain employees were systematically treated by management. Marco from IT support finally admitted that he'd noticed suspicious patterns in project failures that seemed deliberately orchestrated rather than coincidental. Even some of Harlan's most loyal supporters began subtly distancing themselves from him as the office atmosphere shifted dramatically. The most beautiful aspect of this situation was that Harlan couldn't control the narrative anymore, despite his previous mastery of office politics and manipulation. People were finally talking openly, comparing their individual experiences, and gradually realizing that their isolated incidents were actually part of a much larger, more sinister pattern of abuse and discrimination. His seemingly unshakable authority, which had appeared absolutely invincible just 1 month ago, was being quietly but systematically undermined by the very people he thought he controlled completely. The investigation was like a single stone thrown into perfectly still water, creating expanding ripples of awareness and courage that spread far beyond its initial impact point. Truth was finally emerging from years of careful concealment. By the end of my 4th week of unemployment, I had successfully assembled what I knew was a completely devastating case against Harlan that would be virtually impossible for him to defend or explain away. I had overwhelming email evidence, multiple witness statements from current and former employees, detailed documentation of his retaliation attempts against me, and comprehensive records of the department's declining performance under his increasingly toxic leadership style. But perhaps the strongest evidence of all was the unmistakable pattern itself, the systematic, methodical way he had repeatedly targeted successful employees who might potentially threaten his carefully protected position of power within the organization. Dustin's suspicious departure, my own calculated termination, and the ongoing struggles of other talented team members all followed exactly the same predictable script. Initial success and recognition, gradual undermining of authority and credibility, escalating conflicts and impossible demands, and eventual elimination from the company. The case was so comprehensive and well documented that even Harlan's most loyal supporters would have extreme difficulty defending his actions once they saw the full scope of his systematic abusive behavior over multiple years. I had learned valuable lessons from his own methodology, using patience and meticulous documentation to build what I knew was an absolutely unassailable position. The irony was perfect and satisfying. He had unknowingly taught me exactly how to destroy him by first demonstrating all these techniques on me and others. I submitted my formal, official complaint to HR under my own name, this time including my complete identity and attaching every single piece of damning documentation I had carefully collected over the past month. The evidence was absolutely overwhelming and undeniable. Dozens of emails clearly showing discriminatory treatment, detailed witness statements from multiple former employees who had suffered similar abuse, audio recordings of Harlan's clumsy retaliatory phone calls, and comprehensive documentation of the obvious pattern of harassment targeting high-performing team members who posed any threat to his authority. I also included detailed analysis showing how overall department productivity had significantly declined under Harlan's increasingly toxic leadership, with specific examples of lost revenue, missed opportunities, and damaged client relationships that directly resulted from his poor management decisions. The complaint was professionally formatted by a lawyer friend, legally sound in every detail, and completely impossible to dismiss as mere personal grievance or vindictive retaliation. I formally requested a comprehensive investigation, immediate disciplinary action against Harlan, and implementation of new policies to prevent similar abuse from occurring in the future. Within just 2 hours of submitting this comprehensive complaint, I received a call from the HR director personally scheduling a formal interview for the following week. The wheels of corporate justice were finally beginning to turn in my favor, and for the first time in months, I was driving the process instead of being helplessly crushed by it. The waiting period between submitting my complaint and the scheduled interview was absolutely agonizing, but I used this time strategically and productively. I thoroughly researched similar discrimination cases, carefully prepared thoughtful answers for every possible question HR might ask, and meticulously documented any additional retaliation attempts from Harlan or his remaining allies in the company. He tried calling me 2 more times, each conversation more desperate and panicked than the last one, eventually offering to provide excellent references if I would agree to withdraw my complaint and forget everything that had happened. I carefully recorded every conversation, adding each new piece of evidence to my already substantial file of his unethical behavior. Through my trusted network of former colleagues still working in the office, I learned that the internal investigation was extremely thorough and comprehensive, with multiple employees being interviewed about their own experiences with Harlan's leadership style and treatment of subordinates. Some brave souls were finally finding the courage to speak up about specific incidents they had personally witnessed or experienced themselves over the years. The investigation was steadily uncovering years of problematic behavior that had been carefully hidden or deliberately ignored by previous management who didn't want to deal with confrontation. Harlan's carefully constructed world was systematically crumbling around him, and he obviously knew it. His desperation was becoming painfully obvious to everyone in the office, which only made him appear more guilty and unprofessional to corporate leadership. 2 months after my devastating termination, I received a completely unexpected phone call from the company's senior vice president, requesting an urgent meeting about potential opportunities within the organization. At the scheduled meeting in his impressive corner office, I learned that Harlan was being temporarily reassigned to special projects, pending the final completion of the ongoing investigation, and they desperately needed someone with my specific expertise and institutional knowledge to stabilize the chaotic department. The complex project I had originally developed was in serious trouble under Tessa's incompetent leadership, and they needed someone who thoroughly understood its technical foundation to salvage what remained and restore client confidence. They offered me a lucrative consultant position at significantly higher pay than my previous salary, with a clear possibility of permanent placement in a senior leadership role once the investigation concluded. The irony was absolutely delicious and satisfying. Harlan's calculated attempt to completely destroy my career had actually elevated me to a position of power and influence I never could have reached under normal circumstances through traditional advancement. His elaborate sabotage had backfired so spectacularly that it created exactly the opposite of his intended outcome. Sometimes karma works in mysterious but perfect ways. Returning to the familiar office building as a well-paid consultant felt completely surreal, but also deeply and personally satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. Harlan was notably absent from the premises, on extended administrative leave, according to the carefully worded official announcement, and the entire department atmosphere was completely different without his toxic presence poisoning every interaction. People were visibly more relaxed, genuinely more collaborative, and significantly more productive without his constant fear-mongering and manipulation tactics affecting their daily work. Tess had been quietly transferred to a completely different department after the project's near-catastrophic failure, and the remaining team was eager and enthusiastic to work with someone who actually understood the technical complexities of what they were trying to accomplish. I threw myself wholeheartedly into fixing the numerous problems that had accumulated during my forced absence, systematically rebuilding important relationships with frustrated clients who had been seriously disappointed by the project's mismanagement and lack of communication. Within just 2 weeks of my return, we had not only recovered all the lost ground but were actually ahead of our original schedule. The dramatic contrast between my collaborative leadership style and Harlan's authoritarian approach became immediately obvious to everyone, completely validating everything my detailed complaint had alleged about his incompetence and destructive behavior patterns. The company-wide all-staff meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, and tension filled the air as employees gathered in the main conference room. The senior vice president took the podium and announced that Harlan's employment had been officially terminated following a thorough investigation into workplace harassment and systematic discriminatory practices that had created a hostile work environment. They also announced comprehensive new policies for reporting and investigating similar complaints in the future, specifically using my case as a clear example of how the company would handle such serious situations going forward under new management. Sitting in that crowded conference room, listening to the official vindication of everything I had courageously endured and fought against, felt like the sweetest victory imaginable after months of uncertainty and stress. My colleagues looked at me with newfound respect and admiration, finally understanding that I had fought not just for my own career but for all of their safety and well-being. The toxic culture that Harlan had systematically created and maintained was officially dead and buried, replaced by genuine accountability and transparency in all leadership positions. Justice had been served publicly, and everyone clearly understood that speaking up against abuse was not only safe but actively encouraged by senior management. In the productive weeks following Harlan's public termination, I watched with satisfaction as the department transformed into what it should have been all along under competent, ethical leadership. Projects ran smoothly without artificial roadblocks, deadlines were consistently met without last-minute crises, and client satisfaction improved dramatically as communication became honest and transparent. The team members who had been struggling and suffering under Harlan's oppressive leadership suddenly flourished when given proper support, recognition, and encouragement to succeed. Several people thanked me privately for having the courage to speak up against injustice, gratefully admitting that they had wanted to report Harlan's abusive behavior but were terrified of retaliation and career destruction. My decision to fight back despite the personal risks had created a much safer workplace for everyone currently employed there. The company also offered me a permanent position as department director, the exact role Harlan had held, with a substantial salary increase and full authority to completely rebuild the team culture from the ground up. It was the perfect ending to my story. Not just personal vindication and career advancement, but the actual power to prevent anyone else from experiencing the systematic abuse I had endured. The innovative project I had originally developed was not only completely saved from disaster, but became one of the company's most successful initiatives that entire year. The client praised our team's professionalism and technical expertise, specifically mentioning the dramatic improvement in communication and project management since my return to leadership. The success stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had reigned under Harlan's incompetent leadership, providing concrete evidence of his professional incompetence for anyone who still had doubts. I made sure to publicly credit every team member who had contributed to the project's remarkable recovery, systematically rebuilding the collaborative culture that Harlan had deliberately destroyed through fear and competition. The success also validated my technical expertise and natural leadership abilities, proving conclusively that I had been right all along about my value to the company and my potential for advancement. It was deeply satisfying to finally see my original vision implemented correctly and professionally, achieving the impressive results I had known were possible if given proper support and leadership from management. Sometimes vindication comes in the form of simple, undeniable success. As the months passed steadily, more disturbing stories about Harlan's abusive behavior emerged from other departments throughout the company, revealing a pattern of destruction that extended far beyond just my immediate team. Apparently, his systematic approach to targeting successful employees had affected multiple departments over several years of unchecked abuse. Other managers came forward with formal concerns they had raised about his methods, complaints that had been consistently dismissed or ignored by previous leadership who wanted to avoid conflict. The investigation expanded significantly, revealing an extensive network of toxic behavior that had negatively affected dozens of innocent employees over several years of systematic abuse. Several former employees, emboldened by my public success and vindication, filed their own official complaints and even lawsuits against the company for failing to address Harlan's documented behavior sooner. The company settled several cases out of court, implementing comprehensive training and accountability measures to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. My case had become a catalyst for genuine company-wide change, transforming the entire corporate culture for the better and protecting future employees from similar abuse. Standing confidently in my new corner office, the same impressive office that had once belonged to Harlan, I reflected thoughtfully on the incredible journey that had brought me to this position of power and influence. The termination letter that had initially seemed like the complete end of my career had actually been the beginning of something much better and more meaningful than I could have imagined. I had learned that I was significantly stronger than I had ever imagined possible, capable of fighting back against systematic injustice and actually winning against seemingly impossible odds. More importantly, I had learned that staying silent in the face of obvious abuse doesn't protect anyone. It only enables the abusers to continue their destructive behavior unchecked. My willingness to speak up despite personal risks had not only saved my own career but had created a genuinely better workplace for everyone currently employed there. The view from the corner office was beautiful, but the view of my own strength and integrity was even more satisfying and meaningful. I had fought courageously for what was right and won decisively. The ripple effects of my groundbreaking case continued to spread throughout the company and even the broader industry, creating positive changes far beyond what I had originally intended. HR departments at other companies began reaching out, asking detailed questions about our new policies and procedures for handling harassment complaints effectively. I was invited to speak at professional conferences about workplace advocacy and the critical importance of documenting discrimination for future legal action. My story became a powerful example of how one person's courage to speak up could create positive change for an entire organization and beyond. The professional recognition was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that other employees would be better protected because of what I had endured and overcome. Harlan's attempt to destroy me had backfired so completely that it had actually advanced both my career and the broader cause of workplace justice. The student had become the teacher, sharing valuable lessons learned from surviving and defeating systematic workplace abuse. A full year after my devastating termination, I was promoted to regional director, overseeing multiple departments and implementing the cultural changes that had begun with my courageous case. The company's employee satisfaction scores had improved dramatically across all departments, turnover had decreased significantly, and productivity was at an all-time high throughout the organization. The toxic culture that Harlan had systematically fostered was completely eliminated, replaced by an environment where merit was genuinely rewarded and abuse was swiftly addressed by responsive management. I had built a team of talented, motivated professionals who trusted each other and their leadership completely. The contrast with Harlan's reign of fear and manipulation was stark and undeniable to everyone. Every successful project, every satisfied client, every employee who felt safe to speak up was a testament to the importance of fighting against workplace abuse. I had not just survived Harlan's sabotage, I had transformed it into something positive and lasting. Walking out of the office building that evening, I thought about the termination letter that had started this whole incredible journey of transformation and growth. Harlan had handed me that paper thinking he was ending my story, but he had actually given me the motivation to write a much better ending than either of us could have imagined. His arrogance and cruelty had backfired completely, costing him his career while elevating mine to heights I never could have imagined under normal circumstances. The scared, shocked woman who had sat helplessly in his office exactly 1 year ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and would never again allow anyone to diminish it. I had learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's becoming so successful that your enemies become completely irrelevant. As I drove home to my new life, I smiled thinking about tomorrow's challenges and opportunities. I was no longer afraid of difficult people or unfair situations. I had proven to myself that I could handle absolutely anything.